The auction yard reeked of sweat, dust, and the sharp tang of desperation. Sunlight bore down harshly, bouncing off the rusted metal rails of the holding pens where horses shifted uneasily, their eyes filled with uncertainty. Among them stood a skeletal figure, a once majestic chestnut gelding whose body bore the cruel evidence of starvation. His coat, dulled and patchy, clung to his ribs like paper over bone. His head hung low, his ears flicking only slightly as the jeers of the crowd echoed through the barren lot. The auctioneer's voice, gruff and impatient, rang out over the speakers. Lot 37. A fine animal, just needs some care. Who'll start the bidding at 200? Silence answered him. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. A man in a sweat-stained hat spat onto the ground. That one's a lost cause, he muttered to the bidder beside him. Another chuckled, shaking his head. Ain't worth the cost of a bullet. The chestnut horse, ribs stark beneath his sagging skin, flicked his tail feebly as flies buzzed around the raw patches on his flanks. He stood motionless, accepting his fate with an eerie stillness that spoke of long-suffered neglect. The voices around him blurred into a hum, yet something within his dark, sunken eyes burned, a faint but undeniable flicker of life, hidden beneath layers of exhaustion and disappointment. Claire adjusted the brim of her worn-out baseball cap, shifting on the uneven dirt beneath her boots. She had seen broken horses before, but this one was different. There was something about the way he stood, not quite defeated, not yet gone. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides as the auctioneer, growing impatient, lowered his starting price. 150. Anyone. She swallowed hard, feeling the stares of disbelieving buyers around her. She had promised herself she wouldn't do this. She was barely scraping by as it was, her small farm struggling under the weight of overdue bills and dwindling hay supplies. But logic and reason had never been her strongest suits when it came to horses, especially ones who had no one left to fight for them. 100, the auctioneer grunted, clearly eager to move on. A sharp, mocking laugh came from the other side of the pen. Claire turned slightly, catching sight of Calloway, the well-fed, arrogant ranch owner who made a habit of collecting prize horses like trophies. He leaned lazily against the rail, eyes gleaming with amusement. Might as well give him away, he called, smirking, or send him to the meat buyer and put him out of his misery. The murmurs of agreement around him made Claire's jaw tighten. She turned her gaze back to the chestnut. His ears twitched, as if he could hear every cruel word. The flicker in his eyes dimmed, his head lowering a fraction further. Something inside her snapped. 100, she called out, raising her hand. A wave of silence passed over the crowd. The auctioneer hesitated, briefly surprised that anyone had spoken at all. Then, with a shrug, he slammed his gavel onto the wooden block. Sold. A few scoffs and headshakes followed, but Claire ignored them. Her heart pounded as she made her way toward the holding pens, each step heavier with the weight of uncertainty. She had no idea what she had just committed to. The stable hand who led the chestnut toward her barely concealed his skepticism. "You sure about this one?" he muttered, handing her the lead rope. Up close, the horse's condition was even worse. His coat, once a rich copper, had dulled to a lifeless brown, and the hollows above his eyes made him appear older than he likely was. His hooves were cracked, his legs riddled with scars from past injuries that had long been left untreated. Claire exhaled slowly, reaching a hand toward his face. He didn't flinch, but he also didn't move forward to meet her. He simply stood there, distant, detached, a shell of what he once must have been. She took a step back, giving him space. "Let's get you home," she murmured, more to herself than to him. The journey back to her farm was slow and silent. The old trailer rattled with every bump in the road, and every so often, Claire glanced in the rearview mirror. The gelding stood stiffly, his head low, his body swaying slightly with the movement. He never made a sound. When they arrived, she opened the trailer gate carefully, giving him time to process his surroundings. The farm was modest, fenced pastures stretching toward the distant tree line, a weathered barn that had seen better days, and a handful of other rescued horses grazing in the afternoon sun. The gelding, however, barely lifted his head. She led him slowly into a freshly bedded stall, unhooking the rope, and stepping back. He hesitated before finally moving forward, his hooves barely making a sound against the straw. His sides heaved with the effort, though he was still too weak to fight. Claire rested her arms on the stall door, watching as he stood, motionless once again, staring at nothing. "I don't know what they called you before," she said quietly, studying him, "but you're not a number here." The horse didn't respond. His eyes remained dull, unreadable. She sighed, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small cube of sugar. She held it out, palm flat, waiting. He didn't move. Seconds stretched into minutes. The other horses shifted in their stalls, the distant sounds of the farm filling the silence between them. And then, just as she was about to lower her hand, the chestnut took a step forward, a slow, hesitant movement, as if testing the ground beneath him. His nostrils flared slightly as he inhaled the scent of the sugar. He didn't take it, but he didn't pull away either. Claire smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The sun had begun to set by the time she finally left the barn, the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. As she walked toward the house, exhaustion tugging at her limbs, she felt the weight of doubt pressing in. She had taken in rescues before, but none in this bad of shape, none so close to the edge. A gust of wind swept through the fields, carrying with it the scent of hay and earth. She glanced back at the barn, at the single flickering light that glowed from within. Somewhere in that stall stood a horse the world had already given up on. But Claire wasn't the world. She squared her shoulders, inhaling deeply. Neither was he. The first night passed in uneasy silence. The chestnut gelding stood in the farthest corner of the stall, his body rigid with weariness, his gaze distant. Claire checked on him twice before dawn, finding him in the exact same spot each time. He hadn't touched the fresh hay she had spread, nor had he taken a sip from the water bucket. By morning, worry gnawed at her. Horses were fragile creatures, especially those already pushed to the edge. Starvation weakened more than just the body, it stole the will to fight. If he refused to eat, if he gave in to the quiet surrender that had already wrapped itself around him like a shroud, then all the care in the world wouldn't save him. Stepping into the stall with slow, deliberate movements, she crouched near the pile of hay, picking up a handful and holding it toward him. He flicked an ear in her direction, but didn't move. "You have to eat," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. "Nothing." She set the hay down carefully, then reached into her pocket for another sugar cube. If she could just get him to take something, anything, it might be enough to remind him that life still had warmth left in it. This time, he didn't hesitate as long. His nostrils flared, breath ghosting over her palm. His lips brushed against the cube, but at the last moment, he pulled away. Claire held still, heart sinking, and then slowly, as if testing an old, forgotten memory, he reached out again, taking the sugar gently between his teeth. The sound of him chewing was barely audible, but to Claire, it was deafening. She exhaled, relief washing over her. It was something. Over the next few days, she kept a careful routine. Small feedings, frequent check-ins, quiet reassurance. The other horses sensed the new arrival but gave him space, as if recognizing his fragility. The farm's routine moved around him, the rhythm of daily chores continuing as usual. But the chestnut remained a ghost in their midst, even as his strength returned in increments. The slight lift of his head, the occasional swish of his tail, his eyes remained veiled, his spirit locked away behind a wall she couldn't yet breach. One afternoon, as Claire leaned against the paddock fence, watching him stand listlessly under the shade of the old oak tree, her neighbor, Hank, rode up on his bay mare. He was in his 60s, a weathered cowboy with hands that had seen decades of hard work. "You got yourself a project, huh?" he said, tipping his hat back as he eyed the gelding. Claire sighed. "Something like that." Hank studied the horse for a moment before shaking his head. "Ain't just his body that's broke. Whatever happened to him before you got him, it took more than just his weight." "I know," Claire said quietly. "You pick a name yet?" She hesitated. Naming him felt like a responsibility she wasn't sure she had earned. But she had been thinking about it, about the way he stood, like he was bracing for a blow that had yet to come. about the quiet strength buried beneath the weariness. Valor, she said finally. Hank nodded, as if the name fit just right. Takes time, he said, tightening the reins. But if he's got anything left in him, you'll find it. She hoped he was right. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Claire had taken to sitting outside his stall in the evenings, reading aloud from whatever book she had nearby. She didn't try to touch him or force interaction. She simply existed beside him, letting him grow accustomed to her presence, without expectation. On the fifth night, as she read from a well-worn novel, she felt movement beside her. She turned her head slightly, hardly daring to breathe. Valor had stepped closer, his nose stretched toward her, eyes cautious but curious. She didn't move. Seconds passed, and then, in a slow, hesitant gesture, he touched his muzzle to her sleeve. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt of hope through her. She didn't say anything, didn't want to break whatever fragile trust had begun to form. Instead, she let the moment settle between them like dust in a sunbeam. From then on, small changes came more frequently. He began eating without coaxing, drinking without hesitation. He started watching the other horses more closely, his ears pricking forward when they trotted past. The first time he stepped into the turnout paddock, without freezing at the open space, Claire felt something loosen in her chest. But healing wasn't a straight path. 3 weeks after bringing him home, she decided it was time to introduce him to a halter. He had accepted her presence, but touch was still a battle she hadn't won. She moved slowly, talking to him the whole time, letting him see and smell the leather strap before attempting to lift it over his head. The moment it touched his neck, he bolted. It wasn't just fear. It was panic, raw and unrestrained. He crashed into the stall wall, hoofs scrambling for purchase as he backed into the farthest corner, eyes wild with terror. Claire's stomach clenched. She had expected hesitation, resistance, but not this. This was something deeper, something older. She dropped the halter immediately, stepping back with hands raised. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, I hear you." It took nearly an hour for him to calm down, his sides heaving, his body trembling. Claire stayed with him the entire time, sitting outside the stall as the evening air cooled around them. When he finally stopped shaking, she exhaled. "We won't rush it," she promised. "We'll go slow." The next day, she didn't bring the halter. She simply stood in the paddock, hands at her sides, waiting. Valor watched her warily at first, but eventually took a cautious step toward her. And then another. When he finally reached her, he lowered his head, pressing his forehead lightly against her shoulder. Claire closed her eyes, pressing a hand to his neck. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, she knew, truly knew, they would find their way forward together. The morning of the exhibition arrived cloaked in a thick mist, the kind that curled around the barn like an old memory, damp and weighty. Claire stood in the dim glow of the tack room, hands tightening around the worn leather of Valor's halter. This was the moment they had worked toward, the culmination of months of patience, setbacks, and small victories that had stitched together a fragile trust between them. Outside, the quiet hum of preparation filled the air. Horses snorted in their stalls, hooves shuffled against packed dirt, and the distant murmur of voices drifted from the arena. But inside the barn, there was only the steady sound of her own breathing and the slow rise and fall of Valor's chest as he stood beside her. She turned to him, studying the way the soft light caught the deep chestnut of his coat. It was no longer dull and patchy, but rich and full of life. The hollows in his flanks had filled in, his once uncertain stance now replaced with quiet strength. Yet the past still lingered in his eyes, in the way his ears flicked at every distant sound, in the way he sometimes froze at the brush of a hand. "We don't have to do this," Claire murmured, reaching up to stroke his forehead. His ears twitched at her touch, but he didn't pull away. "If you're not ready, we can walk away. No one's forcing us." But that wasn't entirely true. She wasn't sure when it had shifted, when this had become as much about her as it was about him. Perhaps it had started the day she first saw him at the auction, ribs jutting like prison bars beneath his skin. Or maybe it was the night he had touched his forehead to her shoulder, surrendering for the first time, in what must have felt like forever. She had told herself she was saving him, But the truth was, in some quiet, unspoken way, he had saved her too. A soft nicker pulled her from her thoughts. She smiled, brushing her fingers along his cheek before looping the halter over his head. "All right," she said. "Let's do this together." The walk to the arena felt longer than usual, each step measured, deliberate. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the small crowd gathered along the fence line. Most were spectators, but Claire recognized familiar faces among them. Hank, leaning against the railing, his expression unreadable. Melissa, the stable owner, standing with her arms crossed, her lips pulled into a knowing smile. They weren't here to judge. They were here because they had seen the journey, because they understood what it meant for Valor to simply be standing here, breathing, existing beyond the ghosts of his past. Claire swallowed, tightening her grip on the lead rope. Inside the ring, she let out a slow breath before unclipping the lead, stepping back to give Valor space. For a long moment, he didn't move. The silence stretched, thick with uncertainty. Claire held her breath, watching as his ears flicked back and forth, as his nostrils flared, testing the air. And then, something shifted. He took a step. It was small, hesitant, but it was his. Another step followed, then another, until he was moving, truly moving, his muscles stretching beneath his gleaming coat as he broke into a slow, measured trot. The transformation was subtle yet undeniable. Gone was the skeletal frame, the weary, beaten-down posture. What remained was a horse learning to reclaim himself, a creature who had once been discarded now proving, with every step, that he was still here. Claire's throat tightened, her vision blurring at the edges. Then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, Valor did something he had never done before. He lifted his head, ears pricked forward, and let out a deep, resonant whinny. The sound rippled through the arena, silencing the murmurs from the crowd. Claire let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest. He was speaking, maybe for the first time in years, and she had never heard anything more beautiful. The routine itself was simple, nothing extravagant, just a series of exercises they had practiced in the quiet solitude of the paddock. A walk, a trot, a halt. But each movement carried weight, each step a testament to everything they had fought for. There were still shadows in him. She knew that. There would be bad days, moments when the past reared its ugly head, and the ghosts whispered doubts into his ear. But today was not one of those days. Today he was free. As the routine came to an end, Claire stepped toward him, heart hammering. She didn't reach for the lead rope, didn't move to contain him. Instead, she simply opened her arms, and Valor, without hesitation, walked to her. The moment he pressed his forehead against her shoulder, the world around them faded. The applause, the whispers, the distant sound of the wind, it all became background noise to the steadied beat of his heart against hers. She closed her eyes, exhaling. They had made it. Together.